Very, very special day. As always, Tuesdays are my favorite day of the week because of our gathering here. I'm going to be very quick, actually, because we've got a packed schedule. I'm very excited about a lot of the things that are happening today. And I'm going to invite Jim Sims to join me and say a few words.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Happy belated MLK Day to everyone. And if anyone went to the MLK Jr. birthday celebration at Buskirk Chumley last night, Michael Sherman is a linchpin in that program, and I want everyone to recognize that. Now, very briefly, and I know you all might think that I'm gonna get up and do some MLK quotes and all that, and it's worthy for that. But I like to reduce it down to children, if you will, back in our innocent days. There was an art class. Kids were in there drawing pictures. And one student looked at the other student and said, you know, what's the color of love? And the other student thought about it and said, you know, love comes in all colors. Okay, just think. That's as brief as I'm going to be today. And if you don't mind, if you rise, I'll lead you all in the Pledge of Allegiance. And I think you all know that at holidays, we tend to say the pledge on affected holidays. So if you would join me, I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Jim. And it's very special for me to say the pledge on a day like today, following such an important national holiday. So thank you so much. Yes, would you like to come up to the podium and say it? No, they can't online. Yeah. This is our new member, right? Yeah.
My father was my father met Martin Luther King, and my father had a 1962 Ford Falcon. And he came to speak in the community I grew up in. And I remember the story because when he was killed, my father, he really cried terribly. But anyhow, so what happened was it doesn't matter where he was going to speak. So my dad went in our 62 Ford Falcon, which had a stick shift, went and picked him up at the train station, and he had two huge men with him, and they got in the car, and King was in the front. And he said he was the sweetest guy. He said he looked at my car and said, "This is a nice car, Mr. Graham." You know, and my dad was just never. He told that story once, so I thought I'd pass that on. Thank you.
And a huge welcome to Roy. Roy, he's a new member, and it's, as I mentioned last week, it's really great to see that new members are stepping up to the plate, literally, to speak to us as a club. I'm going to invite Phil Eskew to come and do our reflection for the day.
Herbert Taylor was born in Pickford, Michigan in 1893. His father was active in lumber, banking, and telephone companies in the area, and uncles ran the local dry goods, hardware, grocery, and shoe stores. Both of Taylor's parents were devout Christians. He himself went through the motions of worshiping at the local Methodist church until the age of 17. Then an evangelist came to town, and at the last service, Herbert Taylor became convinced, stepped forward, and accepted Jesus Christ as his personal Savior and Lord. After completing high school, Taylor graduated with a bachelor's degree from Northwestern in 1917. He then took a job with the YMCA in France. Soon thereafter, the United States declared war on Germany, and Taylor enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve. The Navy assigned him to a base in Brest, France, where he administered the distribution of food and clothing to Navy units. As a result of the contacts made in France, Taylor was offered two jobs after the war. One was with the Sinclair Oil Company, the other with the YMCA in New York. Taylor's inclination was to take the YMCA job because he loved working with youth. But first, he consulted bank executive George Perkins, who he had met in France during the war. Perkins advised him to follow a three-part plan. First, he should take the job with Sinclair where, Perkins predicted, he would be a success. Second, he should use the skills learned at Sinclair to start his own business. Third, once that business was running smoothly, he should devote most of his time to youth projects. Sinclair sent Taylor to Pauls Valley, Oklahoma to work as timekeeper and assistant to the manager of a pipeline station. A year later, the first oil was discovered in the county. A strong market for oil leases developed, and Taylor decided to become an oil field lease broker. Resigning from Sinclair, he opened an insurance and real estate business specializing in oil field leases. That business was very successful. It not only provided a generous income, but also allowed him the freedom to schedule a significant amount of civic activity. He became active in his church, the Chamber of Commerce, Boy Scouts, High Y, and Rotary. Prior to moving to Oklahoma, Taylor had married Gloria Forbich. He promised her that after spending a few years in Oklahoma, they would move back to Chicago. To keep that promise, he accepted a job with the Jewel Tea Company in 1924. The president of Jewel, Maurice Carker, had commanded Taylor in the Navy and held out the promise of rapid advancement for Taylor at Jewel. Taylor started as an office manager. By 1929, he was a member of the board of directors. In 1930, he was named executive vice president and was in line to become president. Then fate intervened. In 1932, an executive from the Continental National Bank in Chicago asked Jewel to loan Taylor to the Club Aluminum Company on a one-half-time basis. Club Aluminum was on the verge of bankruptcy. The bankers were convinced that the only way to avoid that would be to bring in a proven top-level executive, and Taylor fit that description. Jewel agreed to the request. After settling the lawsuits pending about the company, Taylor concluded that Club Aluminum was $400,000 in debt, with no possibility that the existing level of sales could service short-run debt payments. The creditors' company advised Taylor to file for bankruptcy. Jewel Tea concluded that the situation was hopeless and asked Taylor to return full-time to Jewel. But Taylor could not turn his back on the 250 Club Aluminum employees. After much praying, he decided to give up his $33,000 per year job with Jewel and become president of Club Aluminum at a salary of $6,000 per year. To give the company some more time to accomplish the turnaround, he borrowed $6,100 using his Jewel stock as collateral and put that money into Club Aluminum. When Herbert Taylor took over Club Aluminum, the situation was so desperate that he believed himself to be the only person who thought there was hope. In developing his plan of action, he gave first priority to changing the ethical climate in the company, as he explained many years later, and I quote, "The first job was to set policies for the company that would reflect the high ethics and morals God would want in any business. If the people who work for Club Aluminum were to think right, I knew they would do right. What we needed was a simple, easily remembered guide to right conduct, a sort of ethical yardstick which all of us in the company could memorize and apply to what we thought, said, and did. I searched through many books for the answer to our need, but the right phrases eluded me. So I did what I often do when I have a problem. I can't answer myself. I turn to the one who has all the answers. I leaned over my desk, rested my head in my hands, and prayed. After a few moments, I looked up and reached for a white paper card. Then I write down the 24 words that had come to me. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? I called it the four-way test of the things we think, say, or do, end quote. For several months, he applied the new test to various problems, such as the company's misleading advertising. In those cases where company practice failed the test, he made the necessary changes. He used the test to discourage salespersons from selling dealers more merchandise than the dealers could profitably sell. of using the test to resolve vendor disputes in a win-win fashion, and of making sure that creditors were paid in full. When Herbert Taylor became president of the Rotary Club of Chicago in 1938, he introduced the four-way test to the Rotary world. The test proved to be an ideal tool which Rotary clubs could use to promote high ethical standards in business and the professions. In 1952, Taylor gave permission to Rotary International to promote the test worldwide. Then in 1954-55, Herbert Taylor became president of Rotary International, and he used his presidency as an opportunity to travel around the world promoting the use of the test. In 1954, he also gifted the copyright of the four-way test to Rotary International. In the meantime, Club Aluminum returned to profitability. The company was able to pay off its $400,000 debt within 5 years. Over $1 million in dividends were paid over the following 15 years, and net worth climbed to $1.75 million over the same period. Herbert Taylor formed the InterVarsity Christian Fellowship with chapters on 700 college campuses. Also, the Young Life program in high schools in 40 states. The Christian Service Brigade for Boys and Pioneer Girls with over 100,000 members, and the Child Evangelism Fellowship for 1 million children under the ages of 11. Club Aluminum forgot its heritage. Bought by Sandex International, it was moved to Jacksonville, Arkansas in 1978. 3 years later, when the American National Business Hall of Fame contacted the company for information about Herbert Taylor and the four-way test, a spokesperson for the company said she had no knowledge of either. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. And as with you, I believe that that four-way test is the special sauce that's in the middle of Rotary International that makes it as successful as it is. And let's congratulate Phil. 42 years with Rotary Club yesterday. Congratulations. Good. Well, we have birthdays to celebrate. Eric Powell is January 17th. John Bender is January 19th. And Mary Getzi, one of our new members, is January 20th. Happy birthday to the three of them. Going back to anniversaries, Don Colblazer is 17 years, with 7 years with the Bloomington Rotary Club. And our district governor, who I don't believe is here today, but oh, he's right here in front of me. That's Everly. He's right here in front of me. Congratulations, 21 years with the club. Fantastic. It's great to have you with us. Yeah. That's so funny. Okay, we have so many wonderful guests with us today, all of whom we wanted to join the Rotary Club. So let's see. Tracy Jovanovic, are you here to introduce the guests? Great.
All right, clearly we have a lot of guests here today. You must have gotten the memo that it's a abacus. The history of the abacus is our program, right? All right, kudos to Jeff Richardson. You have your own table of guests here. I'll go through that first. I had so much that I had to get an email specifically. Charlie Richardson, if you would stand, a retired partner of Fagra Drinker Law Firm. Welcome. Jim Mahadi, Jeff's partner, 30 years and retired performing arts teacher. Bill Yarber, IU School of Public Health and distinguished professor and advisor to Kinsey Institute. Gene Cook, former executive in Bloomington City Government. Kyle Siebert, the IU student body president. Excellent to see. Peter Rhoda, director of development for IU. Welcome to have you. That's a full table. No pressure for the rest of us out there. All right, and then we have, I started to say, Phil, I started to say some oldies but goldies. We have a distinguished guest, Phil Amerson. And Phil, if you would stand, a guest of Winston Shindell. He's a Renaissance man, retired. We have Lexi Walters. Where's Lexi? There she is. Alon's guest, great to have you from Gigabit Now. Rachel Kelly, a guest with Tyler Nichols. Welcome, another student. And Joyce Crothies, thank you for the help, Judy, on how to say the name correctly. And Joyce is for School of Nursing. Tony Mesher. Tony's also with Judy, and Professor Emeritus of Anatomy. And then Gene Hurley, Jim Bright's guest. Where's Gene? There we go. Welcome. He's also an attorney. So lots of guests. Oh, I forgot. Where's Dakir? We had to turn the page over. Dakir, great to have you back. One of our PhD students, Dakir Abdullah. That's it.
Thank you so much, Tracy. And Joy, do we have any guests online?
Elon, we have 17 Rotarians and no
Wow.
guests.
That's great. It's great to know that we have 17 members online watching and participating in the program today as well. Thank you. Thank you, Joy.
You're welcome.
Okay, so to our club updates. And before I go there, I just need to see what the time is because I know that we are zipping through. I think I'm going to skip over the financial update. I mentioned last week that I would give you a financial update this week, but I will do it next week. So if you don't mind, I'm sorry about that, but we will definitely get there. I want to mention a few key things. Tim, Jason, do you want to jump up here and we can, and while he's coming up, I just want to mention that Habitat for Humanity is building a house in Bloomington, as they do many, many incredible houses. There is one house that is being supported by the Rotary Club in particular, and we have an opportunity for as many as 20 volunteers from the three clubs, the three Rotary clubs that we have, to get involved in the build of this house. So we will be sending information to you about this online through email, but the dates to think about are February 25th, which is a Saturday, as well as Saturday, March the 4th. And we're asking for you to give us at least 4 hours, if not 4, then 8 hours, if you can make it, between 8:30 and 12:30 or 12:30 and 4:30 on those 2 dates. So we will be sure to give you information about that. It's super exciting that we're involved in the build of that house and very much looking forward to it.
I'll make this very brief. We're going to have a speech contest, but so far we don't have any applicants. So I want you to stir up friends of yours that are in high school. High school student will be giving a speech about the 4-way test, which we heard about. And just after club, I'd like to meet just for about 5 minutes with an ad hoc committee, anybody that's interested in promoting the speech contest on the 4-way test, which is going to come up in the middle of February. And that's why I asked for the time today. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim, and it's great to have you back. He's been traveling quite a bit. Okay, and then we have the Lunch Buddies program that I mentioned last week. The information was on the table, and I believe that it will be shared with you in the roundabout this week again. Go and have lunch with your best friend or take them out to a movie or something like that. For those of you in the book club tomorrow, 7 p.m. at Judy Schroeder's house, right? There's a gathering there. BCT, special event that we're having, the Black Opry Review Tour. For those of you who've not yet booked your tickets, I'm going to be there, and a few of us are going to be there January the 19th. That's this coming Thursday at 7 p.m. So that's Wednesday and Thursday nights. We've got activities going on in our club. And then I'd very much like for you to put your names forward for volunteering during our meetings. Reflections, greetings at the door, introducing our guests. We'd love to get as many of you involved as possible. I should quickly mention that the Habitat for Humanity, I love to mention new members who are getting involved. Thank you so much to the leadership of Michelle Cohen and Mary Getzi, both of whom are brand new members of the club. So let's give a round of applause to both of them. Joining. Okay, so we're going to move on to our program now. We're going to skip Happy Dollars. I'll do Happy Dollars next week as well. So think of the wonderful things that you want to say and bring lots and lots of cash for Teachers Warehouse. Our greeter was Steve Wicks. Thank you, Steve. Yet another new member. Introductions. Thank you very much, Tracy. Our Zoom host, Joy. Reflection, Phil. Thank you so much for the 4-way test contextual discussion there. That was great. Our reporter, Carla Cox-Deckard. And then Michael Shemus is going to be our camera Zoom operator. And then, as always, Tyler Nichols, thank you so much for helping with the production of our program. So I'm going to invite Rex Hillary to the podium here to invite our very distinguished guest.
Our speaker today is Justin Garcia, who is the Executive Director of the Kinsey Institute. He's also the professor of, let's see, I'll get this right, the Ruth N. Hall's Professor of Gender Studies. Okay. Can they hear? Okay. He's published over parts of hundreds of papers, I think. Anyway, he studies people their romantic lives, which is courting, intimacy, and sex. I think that'll be pretty interesting. Thank you.
Okay. What time do you want me? How long do you want me? 30 minutes. Okay. Whatever. Perfect. Hi everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you all this midday. I was about to say this afternoon. It's midday, and happy to tell you a little bit about some of the work we do at the Kinsey Institute. And I'm just delighted to be able to gather with all of you. Thanks for everyone who's here. I have to be cautious because I have Kinsey Institute colleagues here, my colleague Dev Montanez and Bill Yarber, but also when the university historian is here, Jim Capture. Whenever I say something historical about the Institute, I wince just a little bit because I know he knows I get the details occasionally. You know, I'm a scientist. I like a little, I add a little drama that maybe wasn't there. Okay, I think we're good. So I'm going to take you through a couple of things, and I actually have too many slides, so there's some things I'll go through quickly. We can go back, jump around, but also feel free to jump in. I'm happy to be interactive and answer questions. So a little bit about the Institute. Some of you know, in this last year, we celebrated this Institute's 75th anniversary, one of the longest running research institutes at IU. Those one of those careful things I have to be. Traditionally, there were institutes and research centers that eventually became departments or programs. But the Kinsey Institute has a really interesting history. It's not like any other institute in the world. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about that legacy that we can and should be proud of. So this is as we think about those 75 years, it's really a testament. There's a lot that I'll talk through in the next 20 minutes or so about Kinsey's legacy. And we think about what even is it? What is the Institute? It has a few different names. It was first incorporated as the Institute for Sex Research. It was later renamed the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction. But our primary core, and what has been the core for 3/4 of a century, is understanding sexual and gender diversity and increasingly relationship diversity. A lot of my own work is how people's relationships look different in different parts of their lives and different parts of the world. And one of the things we're not an advocacy center, so we certainly have views like everyone else, but the Institute itself is focused on documenting and understanding the variety of people's intimate lives. What does it look like? Why does it look like? What are the mechanisms underlying that? So we really taken a scientific approach to say, what is sex and sexuality? And our faculty are called on as experts in all sorts of ways, whether it's legislation around issues of sexual orientation, whether it's issues about sexual assault. So since I started as the director, we've built out our sexual violence research program quite a bit. If you want to understand sexual violence, you can't just look at violence. There's a difference between walking down the street and punching someone and the incidents of rape on college campus, in the military, that haven't changed in 35 years. So the numbers that we have from around the late 1970s of sexual violence haven't changed. That takes a sexological approach. You need people who understand gender and sex and sexuality. It's not just a question of violence. So that's really what we try and do at Kinsey. We pull those threads together and say, how do we tackle these complex questions that people haven't been able to answer, is the bottom line. So that's part of what we do. So I'll tell you a little bit about the person our institute is named after, Dr. Kinsey. He came to IU in 1920. He was a professor. He started as an assistant professor in at the time zoology, what we would now call biology. And he was an entomologist. He studied gall wasps. You could see in the picture of the right. So gall wasps, those of you who are nature inclined, you'll notice that sometimes on plants they develop, it looks like a small tumor around the stem. What that actually is a species of wasp, many species of wasps, lay their eggs inside the plant. And then the plant forms a defense mechanism around it. It forms what's called a gall. So Kinsey studied those galls and the wasps that lay their eggs inside these. Thousands and thousands of specimens. Actually, this summer I got to visit, when Kinsey passed away, his wife, Clara Kinsey, donated the gall wasp collection to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And I was there this summer. I had never actually seen the full collection. And you walk into this room in the entomology department, and it's 7.5 million samples of insects and wasps. And you just think to yourself, what kind of obsessive person does this? I'm obsessive, so I said it with a tone of appreciation, but it helps understand the work that he later did on sexuality. He was detailed, he was methodical, and it also helps us understand how he got into this. So Kinsey actually in his own right was a very well-respected biologist at IU. He had all sorts of accolades. In 1933, he published a widely used introductory biology textbook. My own PhD is in evolutionary biology. So I knew Kinsey's name from almost a different context, not just from his work on sexuality. And what was so interesting about his intro biology textbook that he wrote while here as an IU professor was that it used evolutionary theory as a framework throughout the whole book. Now we take that for granted today, that any introductory biology class uses evolution as a unifying framework. But what Kinsey did at his time, it was often relegated to a subsection of a chapter as a theoretical framework that you would have to study if you knew biology. But to really think, he always thought in these integrative ways. How do the parts all come together? So I'm a New Yorker, as you'll hear me slip occasionally. As I get tired, I'll say 40 and water and coffee. But he was a Jersey boy, Kinsey, so grew up in Hoboken before training at Harvard, and then coming to Bloomington. So his own work on gall wasps actually established him as an expert. So again, I want us to think a little bit about that obsessive way of thinking. Well, it turns out that in 1938, he was asked to team teach IU's marriage course, what we maybe would call the sexual hygiene course today, later what we would call a sexuality class, but it was really on all the things that students had to think about in terms of marriage. At the time, you had to be married to take that class. And also keep in time the historical context, 1938. Half of IU's, any university student, part of my own work is on singles, so I think of this stuff. Half of young people in the 1930s would have been married at a college, or at least engaged. Very different from our students today. You can lecture a class of 500 and say, just curious, how many are married or engaged? And maybe you get one hand that goes up. So in a short period of time, I said I'm an evolutionist. I often think in huge swaths of time, like 10,000 years ago, people did this. But in just a few decades, we have seen dramatic changes in the way that we partner up. We'll talk about that later. But the marriage course in 38, Kinsey was teaching, in some ways, it represented the very best of university life. You teach a course, there's so many questions from the students, and you realize, I can't answer these. No one can answer these. Let's get some answers. Let's do research and find solutions to these real life questions that students are lining up and asking. So Kinsey started interviewing students and people in the community. But 2 years into that project, now what's funny is that at the time, the university thought, well, this is a safe bet. We'll ask someone in biology to do the anatomy, sexual anatomy and reproductive anatomy part of the marriage course. They didn't expect it to blossom into this massive sexological study. So 2 years in, the university president, Herman Wells, said to Kinsey, you can either interview and do this massive study, or you can teach the course, but you can't do both. There's a conflict there of interviewing your own students. Kinsey chose becoming functionally probably one of the first research professors at IU. He was no longer formally in the classroom. Although I want to go on and show some images later. I probably did more education than most faculty can think of ever accomplishing in their lives. So that's when these studies started. And Kinsey's goal was to document America's sexuality. And it was really a behavioral assessment. It was, the Institute at the time collected over 18,000 interviews. Kinsey himself did over 8,000 of those interviews. They lasted anywhere from 3 to 18 hours. They would often occur over multiple days. You didn't have to sit there and keep going. And there were a lot of methods that Kinsey introduced that actually we still use today. He would never ask a participant, and what's interesting is if you've ever seen images of him, he often looks quite serious. But in the historical record, all these people who interviewed with him described him as being so charming and warm. And for anyone who knows qualitative research and interviews, that's a trick. You need to, a trick of the trade, you really need to make people feel comfortable to open up and to share their stories with them. They need to know that what they're sharing with you is going to be safe and not be misused in order for them to tell a story. So these interviews were really documenting. As an example, Kinsey wouldn't ask, have you ever had an affair? He would say, how many years into your marriage the first time you had sex outside your marriage? And the idea, it's a subtle change, but the idea is that you didn't put an onus on someone to admit to something that maybe they didn't want to. He really focused on behaviors. He really focused on what did you do, what age did you do it, not even as we think about sexual orientation, not in the way we talk about it today with identity. He was interested in how many male partners have you had, how many female partners have you had, how many male fantasies, how many female fantasies. It was really a behavioral documentation of the human experience. Interestingly, this was way before our modern takes on research ethics and compliance. But as you can see on the left, Kinsey and his team utilized an interview technique that if you saw that, you wouldn't be able to decipher, like, what did they interview this person for 6 hours about? There's all this scribbling on the paper. And that was on purpose, so that if the files were ever taken, that they couldn't be transcribed. He took quite seriously that when people were sharing a part of their lives with us, we owe it to them to protect that data, to protect that information, to make sure it's secure. So the researchers could uncode that, but we still have those. They're impossible to decipher. So at Kinsey's original time, an institute changes in 75 years, but the initial focus was a lot on the what, on the kind of the what questions, the documenting what was going on in people's lives. And there were all sorts of things actually that can come up in those sorts of cases. I know there's a few lawyers in the room actually. So I just had a call recently. Every so often we get calls for expert witness. And I had a call recently about a particular behavior. And they said, well, has this ever been documented? And I thought, well, actually it was abuse of an animal, sexual abuse of an animal. And someone said, has this ever been documented? And I said, well, Kinsey's time, he suggested that 50% of farm boys at some point have a sexual experience with an animal. And the lawyer on the phone went quiet for about a minute. I was like, are you still there? And they were like, how do you, I said, I'm not, and again, it's not a question of condoning. I'm not in the business of telling people what they should or shouldn't do in their bedroom. But it is saying, how do we document what's there? What do we know about what's happening in the world? How does that inform our all sorts of things, including what we think of as crimes? So Kinsey is perhaps best known for this intervention, the Kinsey scale. So this isn't a distribution, but it is to show that sexual orientation occurs on a continuum, from 0, exclusively heterosexual, to predominantly heterosexual, to incidentally heterosexual, to bisexual, to incidentally homosexual, to predominantly homosexual, to exclusively homosexual. So that we have this variation of scale. And in fact, when you talk to people, and what Kinsey found and what we still find in research, is that people fall in all sorts of ways. They might say, well, I'm totally heterosexual, but there was that one time when I was in the military that I took a shower with another man and we touched each other. Right? So you start to hear these sorts of stories. And then you say, well, what do we make of that? Does that mean that the person is not entirely heterosexual? Does it mean that they're predominantly heterosexual? I use military as an example because it's been documented. It's what we call situational sexualities. It happens in military and prison, on college campuses, that people respond to, not to equate those as the same environment, but we know that we respond, right, to our situations around us. Many people, if we ask our students today, they might have an orientation, but they'll say, well, there was one time that I was out at Nick's and I kissed someone of the same gender. And you might say, does that question your orientation? They go, well, no. Right, so there's all sorts of ways. So what Kinsey was interested in thinking about, well, what are all your behaviors? And we know as scientists today, we separate your behavior from your identity, from your preference, right? There's all sorts of situations that could impact what you're, so if we use prison as an example, we know that a lot of men in prison will develop intimate relationships with other men, maybe even kind of almost like a boyfriend. But if they're outside of that prison environment, they might identify as heterosexual. Why might they have a boyfriend? Because it can reduce the likelihood of prison rape. So we can think of our sexualities as responding to all these things in our environment. So our behaviors don't always align with our identities, and they don't always align with our preferences. Depends on where you are and what the environment. Women in the highlands of the Himalayas will often marry brothers. It's called fraternal polyandry. Has to do with the sex ratio imbalance that happens because of the hard work men do, the lethal work that they do often on the land. So we know we're always responding to our environment. Kinsey was really interested in that. Okay, I'm going to jump forward quick. So we know that the sort of 2 blockbuster books out of the Institute was the 1948 Sexual Behavior of the Human Male and 1953 Sexual Behavior of the Human Female. So the actual Institute, some of you might be good at math, are saying, I said the marriage course was in 38, that's more than 75 years ago. So the Institute was formed in 1947 to be a separately incorporated 501c3 at IU. It isn't any longer. But at the time it was to encapsulate the data that would eventually go into these books, to secure the institute and the collections that were accumulating there. They were both instant blockbuster books, bestsellers. Interestingly, the first book got Kinsey on the cover of Time magazine. The second book they started burning and people called for him to be killed. And you might take that to, it also highlights a little bit of hearing about sexual behavior in men versus hearing about it in our mothers and daughters and sisters and wives. So America responded very differently to thinking about sex in the context of men's lives versus women's lives. Interesting because in many ways, as a scientist, the second book was actually much richer. It was much more theoretical, in part because the first book kind of took for granted that a sexual event was associated with orgasm in men, with an ejaculation or orgasm event. In women, they realized they couldn't make that same numerical use of data, because as we know, women's sexual response, particularly orgasm, is quite variable. Only about a quarter of women reliably orgasm from penetrative intercourse. So we know that then, like the fundamental data you were using, you had to just totally think of reanalyzing things differently. So the second book, I think, was a lot richer, the behaviors they used, the context they used. And I think even for today, it's a good question in terms of what do we think about? What is someone's sex life? What are those constituent parts? Is it holding hands? Is it sex? Is it someone that you can confide your deepest secrets in? What makes up this thing we call our sexual life that's important to us? Those are all questions we continue to ask today. And there's different, I say the holding hands, I'm personally interested in cuddling and intimate touch. And as an example, we just did a study fairly recently, this was not Kinsey, this is one we did just recently on 1,000 married people in America. 34.4% of Americans say they're not touched enough by their intimate partner. So, I think when we think of the questions that we still ask, that a third of married Americans are walking around and saying, I don't have this sort of basic mammalian thing of touch. I'm not getting enough of it in my relationship. These become profound questions we still ask in terms of how we think about the shape of sexuality. What do I have, about 5 minutes or? Okay, perfect. So as I said, Kinsey was on the cover of Time magazine. As you can see, I love that image. We have it at the Institute. I'll talk about the Institute in a second. And of course, one of my favorite, one of my favorite quotes from Kinsey, actually long before I came here, I had it as the initial quote in my dissertation in New York. We are the recorders of facts, not the judges of the behaviors we describe. Again, it's sort of this highlight that Kinsey wasn't really in the advocacy business. It was more in terms of documenting and understanding what people were doing. I also wanted to bring this up. I know that there's some lawyers in the room. Some of you know the history of Kinsey and IU. A very famous US Customs case that started in the 1950s. Kinsey himself died in 1956. The case was finalized in 1957. A lot of people actually suggest that it led to his early death. And this was Indiana University went to court with US Customs over these famous 31 photographs. And this is Harriet Pilpul, who really helped with that case. And it was really a bedrock case for understanding academic freedom, the right for researchers to acquire materials. So early in his career, Kinsey acquired about 15,000 items that people started to sell him, photographs, letters. There's this one case, there's this photograph collection of people who were arrested for cross-dressing, right? We wouldn't think of that today, but that all these different materials, often that were really deeply personal. Today, that collection is over 600,000 items. It's the largest collection of sexual materials in the world and most diverse collection. And so this case was really important to how we understand the right to collect those materials, to study those materials. So what happened was they sent 31 photographs in the mail, and the US Customs seized that package and opened it and called it obscene. They declared it obscene. But it turns out US law has a funny definition about what is obscene. And in the definition, you have to be using it for personal pleasure, basically. And when they made the case that this was a research document and that it was being applied for research, it didn't fail the sniff test of government regulation. So it's still used as a case of understanding that. And of course, Kinsey was hugely supported by Wells. When we think about this remarkable research program, part of that was only possible because of Wells. All right, I want to jump through just to sort of talk a little bit about a couple of things, and then so for time for some questions. So as I said, the actual institute was established in 1947. It was called the ISR, Institute for Sex Research. We sometimes, you'll hear that name, although today we just usually go by the Kinsey Institute. When we think about what's in the collections today, I have to update those numbers, but you can see how much it's grown. We have a lot of photographs, we have a lot of fine art, we have certainly a lot of archives and books. And I want to invite you all to come see it. So at some point, our new space in Lindley Hall, we have a new art gallery, the Dr. Carolyn Beebe Art Gallery. We have a library reading room. Most of these things are off-site. We have them in a secure location off-site. But we have things that come in. We often have art galleries, exhibitions, and certain exhibitions on campus. I'll show you some quick images. So for our research program, a lot of the questions then went to the why. Kinsey and team were documenting the what. We then moved to the why of why are people doing the things that they're doing that we now know that they're doing. And certainly that was Paul Gebhard, who succeeded Kinsey as the director, longest serving director for 26 years, was an anthropologist really interested in understanding those why questions. I'm going to kind of jump just because I want to get to the end because I put too much in here. But we also know over the year, so actually when Kinsey died, he was partway through a third book. He was about a third through another book, a third Kinsey report. And a lot of it, interesting, you might see pregnancy, birth, and abortion was one of the projects that came out of the Institute well before we think about contemporary discussions about those issues. And again, the Institute was really documenting the impact on regulation, on people's intimate lives, on their reproductive lives, on their health and well-being. And remember, this was the time when people were really dying from illegal abortions, right? So much different kind of data needed to be collected in terms of how we understand how that's impacting people's lives. Again, not a statement on what people should or shouldn't be doing, but what is happening? How do we know what's happening in the world around us? They also did a lot of work on sex offenders. At the time, a lot of the funding was on what was called sexual deviancy. So people who were involved in sexual issues that were resulting in criminal prosecution. A lot of different projects over the years, classic studies on understanding what is sexual orientation were conducted at the Institute, particularly by Alan Bell and Marty Weinberg and many others. Really kind of what is this thing that we're calling orientation? What does it mean? What is homosexuality? What is... over the years, there were also, particularly in the 80s, some very important symposia on HIV/AIDS were housed right here, looking at research, particularly from the research perspective. You might take it for granted, but the early work on HIV/AIDS, actually, my colleague Bill Yarber did a lot of this work. He wrote the first curriculum for the federal government. A lot of the early work on HIV/AIDS didn't talk about sex. Now, we might think of that today as just sort of being mind-boggling, not talking about the behavior that was associated with transmission, but that was the case. And that's why I often think when we are afraid or bothered about using the S word or talking about sex and sexuality in our lives, it doesn't do us service. Right? How do you talk about a pandemic disease that's sexually transmitted and you're not willing to talk about the role of sex in that? That's just, it's just insane, all right? So, but you think about that. When I think about why the work we do is important to push those conversations forward, it has to be part of how we understand the human experience. Oh, sorry, I didn't hit the slide. So those are some of the examples from that. I just wanna, I'm gonna skim through some of these real quick, and then, so we have a little time for questions. As I said today, our new space is in Lindley Hall. So that when we think about the whole Kinsey Institute, it's actually bigger than people realize. So we have 9 research centers and institutes at Kinsey and laboratory groups. And then we have the collection, so the library and the special collections. So we have kind of multiple units within what we call Kinsey. And the labs work on everything, as I said, from sexual violence to physiology, to couples. We have a well-known condom use research team for who 25 years have been understanding the impact of condoms. Questions on couples. We're doing a study now. Had anyone seen in the New York Times maybe 2 years ago the 36 questions to fall in love? They sort of famous that you can go through with a partner, and you could do it if you're in a current relationship. It brings you closer together. It was a task by psychologist Arthur Aaron. It's meant to normally if you get to know someone over the course of 6 or 12 months, you do vulnerability, you do self-disclosure. So what these questions do is they put you in front of someone and you rapidly go through. You say, tell me something you like about me. I'm going to tell you something you like about me. Tell me something that you don't usually tell other people. So you force them to be vulnerable. You force them to disclose interest. So we're doing a study now where we brought couples in the lab, new college couples, and we hooked them up to psychophysiology equipment to look at the physiology of falling in love. So what happens to them as they go through those questions? So we do a lot of different studies to understand the mechanisms of how we connect. We also, some of you heard, we're really excited. We have a new partnership with the business school. It's called the Kinsey Kelly Center for Gender Equity in Business. Again, I'm personally really committed to a lot of these issues around sexual harassment and sexual violence. So at the business school, our new director is April Sellers, who's a clinical professor of business law and ethics. and the Pam Yitchy, director of the center. So we've been working with Kelly to really think about, we think a lot of these trainings on sexual harassment. Many of you, if you've been in businesses or companies, universities, you do a 30-minute or a 1-hour training on sexual harassment. It's just for legal liability. They don't work. None of them work. There's no good data that they actually can change behavior. So as a behavioral scientist, I thought, well, let's actually do something about this issue. Stop just worrying about lawsuits and actually reduce all the negative things that are associated with it. So we've been working with that. And at our core is collaboration. We do big projects. We have a very big project in my lab called Singles in America. It's fully sponsored by Match.com, the dating company. I'll give you dating advice later over coffee. And but we know that part of it is because at a sex institute, for the work we do, it can be really hard to get federal funding for our research. The program officers will tell us, can you take sex out of the title? And you're like, okay. And then they call and they say, can you take sex out of the abstract? And you go, oh my God. And then they'll call and they say, can you just take sex out of the grant? And I'm like, it's a sex institute. What do you want us to write about? This is our expertise. And the issue is they often worry about the legislature raising questions about it because there is that nuance. How do we understand, right? How do you understand why do we need to study it? So we often get corporate funding. A lot of our research is funded actually through industry and corporate partnerships. As I said, we often do a lot of education programs. So those of you who use social media or you can sign up for our email newsletter. You can follow us on social. We'll often have programs around issues of obscenity, censorship, academic freedom. The Kinsey Institute we were the leading voice on the impact of COVID on people's romantic and sexual lives. So we did a lot of studies on how sexual frequency decreased during the pandemic, but most marriages fared pretty well, actually. Over 80% of people in marriages said that they got closer during the pandemic. I think that's another testament of our relationships. It took being locked up together for a year for us to turn to our intimate partners and say, is there something we've never really talked about? Is there something that you've always wanted to do, right? So actually most couples fared pretty well. Actually, my parents moved in with me they were in New York. So they lived with me for 6 months at the start of the pandemic. So when people thought about how did it impact your intimate life? I said, it's the closest we've ever been. I've never spent so much time, but I lived with my parents in my 30s. I didn't have a sex life. But it certainly made us think about ways that we were connecting, right, and valuing each other. And actually, that was true for the vast majority of Americans. This was when the Wall Street Journal covered our work. I just love that cover because we were getting these questions. I remember a woman called me one day and she said, "Well, should we wear a mask when we have sex?" And she was serious. She was worried, and I thought, that's not going to help. But we were kind of going through the dark together. And that exactly, actually, Jim uses the expression often of thinking of the Institute as a beacon, a source of light. That's what we've always been for 75 years. When you have those questions, do you ask your doctor? Do you ask most people don't. In one study, only 40% of gynecologists talk to their patient about their sex life. If they don't, certainly a podiatrist doesn't, right? And where do you go? Where do you find the answers? What is that beacon? What is that source of questions of just saying, what should we be doing and got to get through this? And the Kinsey Institute is that. And I think we want to remain that. Certainly questions about people, how we were reconnecting. One of the things we do at Kinsey is we're decidedly public facing, more than almost any other unit at the university, at almost any university. So we do a lot of public education. There's a picture famously of Kinsey lecturing at Berkeley we have in the halls at the Institute when you come over and visit us. And I love it because the men's gymnasium is packed. And the joke was always that Kinsey got more people in the gymnasium for his lecture than any of the sports events ever did. And just this idea that how do we use this information? In academic terms, we call it bench to bedside. How do you do laboratory research and get impact out in the world? And that's one of the things we really try and do is share our findings with the world in a thoughtful and academic way. So you can follow us on social. And I'm going to end just with a couple pictures of the collections, and then Elaine's going to give me the boot. So, yes, it's great. So as you can see, a lot of our collections, those 600,000 items, some of them are historical, thinking about the reception of Kinsey. And this is the one on the bottom is a great song that we play at some of our events sometimes. It goes, hey, hey, Dr. Kinsey. And I'll give you the full song after a glass of wine. And we have all sorts of archives at the Institute. We have in our library reading room, for instance, this wonderful letter from Sigmund Freud to a mother. And a mother wrote describing her son, and she was really worried. And Freud wrote back and said, your son sounds perfectly fine. He's just a homosexual. But these sort of reminders, I think, often of when you think of this grand data, of what we have. Of course, Masters and Johnson, some of you know the television show Masters of Sex. That was based on Masters Johnson. They came after Kinsey. They were most known for their book in '66 on human sexual response. And all sorts of collections of how, again, when I think sometimes people think of Kinsey and they think, oh, do you all have Playboys in your office? We're like, no, we do have Playboys. But the reason we have them is because it documents an aspect of American cultural history of how we thought as a society. We thought about sex and sexuality and bodies and gender. So these become part of the historical record. We also have a spectacular fine art collection. Some of you know the works of Robert Mapplethorpe. We have a very significant collection of over 30 Mapplethorpes. George Platt Line, who's well known for his work of the New York City Ballet. If those of you have been to my office, I have Platt Lines in my office. They're just spectacular images of light. And then, of course, there is this partnership we had this year with the IU Alumni Association, the journey of Tom Fox, an IU alum who had HIV/AIDS and his journey of sort of going through that process. A really powerful exhibition. I'm looking at my friends in the back table because I think we all cried a couple of times going through that. A really powerful exhibition of thinking about what was this journey of people with HIV and AIDS, and where is it documented? Emilio Sanchez, which was on the US Postal Service, put him on a stamp. We're one of only 2 collections in the world that have Sanchez's. He used to make these sorts of images in the morning to warm up his wrist. Gay Cuban artist who spent most of his life in the closet. Every major museum has the architectural drawings. We have those, but only 2 have these more what we call intimate forms exhibition we had. And a lot of our work is now available online. And of course, those of you that get to stop by Lindley Hall, and I'll end with this, our sculpture. So that's our artist, Melanie Pennington. I didn't know when they transport art. She sent me this picture. She goes, okay, he's leaving. And I just wrote back in all caps, where's his head? And they actually decapitate him when they transport, and they actually take the limbs off when they bronze it. But this is now behind Lindley Hall. It's as part of the People of IU series that you can see. So come take your selfie with it. And then our bus is just wrapping up around town, a reminder of, of our unique lives. That's our anniversary events. There is our historical marker outside Swain Hall where Kinsey began. And I'll end on this quote by Kinsey. It's another one that I really love. It is desperately strategic that our civilization realize something of the diversity in human sex behavior and acquire some sympathetic understanding of that which is different from one's own. Thank you, and hope come and visit us soon.
So what I think we'll do is we'll have 2 questions from the room first of all, and then if anybody online wants to give a question as well, because we've got a certain limitation on time. So I believe Charlotte is the first who raised her hand. And
Great. Okay, great. Hi, Charlotte.
I'm supposed to talk to the side. My question is, this is all in the United States and English-speaking area. What's happening in the rest of the world?
Oh, that's such a good question. So if you didn't hear, Charlotte's question was, is this a lot in the United States? A lot of our data is US based, but not all of it. So in fact, our COVID study was multinational. Our researchers just published a study on 51 nations of looking at sex. So it depends on the particular studies. What we see when we take when we widen the lens to think, it's interesting as what Kinsey did as an evolutionary biologist, and what a lot of us think today, even in public health and different disciplines, is how does an individual respond to their particular environment, whether that's legislation, right? We work with certain countries where non-heterosexuality is illegal, or where there's high risk. For instance, I was doing a project with a colleague in Turkey. And Turkey is a really interesting context because they have high rates of what we call homosociality. So you'll see 2 straight men walking down the street holding hands, maybe with their wives behind them holding hands. So things that here you would say, oh, that seems like maybe they're a couple, that straight men in the US don't do that. But if there's any evidence of same-sex behavior among those men, they can face huge amounts of violence and death, actually. So we think about how these different contexts of how we think of social behavior, relationships, sex, they vary quite a lot in different cultures. One of the things I'm interested in is a lot of countries now, particularly Japan is a great example. The government is trying to get people to marry more and have more births. So it's what we're seeing is what's called sub-replacement fertility. So on average, a couple has to have 2.1 kids to account for mortality rates. You have to have 2.1 kids in order to maintain a population level. So everyone has to have about 2 and a few people have 3. But what we're seeing in certain countries is sub-replacement fertility. But part of that is because people aren't having sex. So people are delaying sex until late into their lives. The age at first sex is pushed back. Their sexual frequencies are quite low. So we're working with colleagues actually in the Japanese context to understand why. Are people working too much? Is it hormones in the diet? Is it all sorts of interesting questions? But it's a really important point that these things vary at different places in the world. Thank you.
So I'm very mindful of time, and I just want to know if somebody online has a quick question that you can answer in 30 seconds, and then we'll move, and then we'll invite you to stay for a second after the end. So anybody online? I think we're good, gone. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to just quickly wrap up here, and then if you don't mind staying for a bit, then we can continue the conversation between us. So that was spectacular. Thank you so much. Thank you. In honor of our guests, we like to support a local agency, and the local agency for this quarter is Pets Alive. So for those of you who love pets, that's a wonderful piece of news. Next week, actually, before we go to next week, I just want to quickly thank Jim Simmons once again for leading us in the pledge. Thank you so much always for everything that you do in this club. We have a very special guest with us today, Amina Mohammed, who is a member of the family that we've been supporting from Afghanistan. Please welcome. I believe this is Amina's first time to a Rotary meeting. Is that right? Right. Well, it's great to have you. And I've enjoyed getting to know you and your family through the months that we've been seeing you here. And Helen Diaz is with her as well. Very nice to have you with us. And also Anil Nair is here from Connecticut. I believe, Anil, you were here with us before. It's great to see you again. And Megan Gerhardt, you're here with us as well. So just wanted to mention to everybody that we have. So next week, we have one of our own. We're going to be meeting again here in the Georgian room. And we have Bryce Bowe, who's going to be talking to us. He's a faculty in the Kelley School of Business, as some of you already know. And he's going to be talking about blockchain, NFTs, and digital assets. Whoa, here we go. I think it's going to be great. I've been following these stories with great interest. And who knows, every single program is spectacular, right? So. Well, thank you. And let's share the four-way test. Actually, before we do that, I just want to say how much the Kinsey Institute reminded me of our four-way test. So thank you. Let's go with the four-way test. Of the things we think, say, or do. First, is it the truth? Second, is it fair to all concerned? Third, will it build goodwill and better friendships? Fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? And fifth, is it fun? Thank you. Thank you so much, everybody. We'll see you next week.